What secrets does the silent rider carry as he emerges from the fading light of the prairie? Who is the skull-masked figure haunting the horizon, and what fate ties them together? And can one man protect a town and stand against an entire crowd of ruthless enemies? These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. A frontier town at dusk is a place of shadows, deep, long, and heavy with secrets. The kind of place you can hide behind a good lie or a low-brimmed hat. I've seen both work just as well. The wind howled through that evening, tugging at broken shutters and whistling through the gaps in the old saloon's walls, carrying whispers of stories nobody dared to tell out loud. Folks around here didn't much care for strangers, not because they had anything worth protecting, but because strangers tended to spell trouble. It was on such a night that the stranger rode in. His horse was gaunt, its ribs like the spokes of a broken wheel, and the man wasn't much better. Covered in a coat that had seen the better part of a decade, he slumped in his saddle like he carried the weight of 10 lives on his back. But he had the stranger's look about him, the kind of figure the plains spit out when it was done chewing them up. He reined his horse and right at the watering trough outside the general store, movements slow but deliberate. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth. No words, just sideways glances and whispers that blended into the hiss of the wind. I watched him from the corner of my eye, sitting outside the saloon with a bottle of something strong and cheap. People like him. They either came here to hide, or they came here too proud to stay down. Either way, they didn't linger. He dismounted, his boots scraping against the dirt, and tied his horse to the rail. That was when I noticed it. Kid, a boy, no older than 6 or 7, perched behind him on the saddle, hanging on with pale, scrawny arms. His face was dirty, hair a matted mess, but it was his eyes that struck me. They had that same look as the stranger's, hounded and hollow. 2 ghosts riding into a town too broke to even play host. "Mama, who's that man?" I heard a child's voice, a girl standing with her mother in the doorway of the bakery. She was shushed quickly, the way you'd hush someone leaning too close to a rattlesnake. Nobody wanted trouble, but trouble had clearly come wrapped in skin and silence. The man stepped onto the warped planks of the general store's porch, his boots making a hollow sound in the gathering dark. The boy stayed by the horse, lips pressed together like he didn't trust even his breathing to be safe. I could feel the tension coil in the air as tightly as the stranger's jaw. He didn't even have to say a word to make people uneasy. Some men carry storms in their silence. When the door of the store swung open, the light from inside spilled out, painting the stranger as little more than a shadow. He spoke low, so low I couldn't catch the words, but I caught the sharp motions of storekeeper. The older man made some big fuss about shaking his head, even stepping back toward the shelves. Whatever the stranger wanted, it was clear he wasn't getting it easy. "You got money, or don't ya?" The storekeeper's voice rang out finally, louder now that he had an audience of nervous folks watching from their porches or windows. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the man, eyes like flint, before reaching into his coat and pulling out a small leather pouch. He set it down on the counter slow, so slow, like he was afraid the air itself might tear it apart. There was a rattle of coins, the kind of sound that makes men lean forward instinctively. But when the pouch opened, it spilled out nothing but dust and coppers. "Get out of here," the storekeeper growled. "Ain't nothing to trade for, and I don't need beggars crossing my threshold." The kid by the horse fidgeted, his small fists balling up as the man raised his voice. But the stranger didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there staring at the storekeeper like he was making up his mind about something. Then, without a word, he nodded, a slow, deliberate nod that carried neither agreement nor submission, just the acknowledgement of a long, drawn-out loss. He turned, stepped back into the night, and untied his horse, lifting the boy back onto the saddle like it was the easiest thing in the world. As the creak of the animal's gait faded into the wind, the whispers dragged behind them. Folks stayed glued to their spots, watching the two vanish into dusk, like the plains themselves had swallowed them back whole. Trouble, I thought to myself, watching that dirt trail pull into silence. Not because of anything he'd done, no words, no fights, no guns, but trouble clung to him like the dust of the prairie. And trouble always finds its way back. It was barely an hour later when the first scream echoed across the town, chilling enough to still even the wind. A woman's cry, coming from the bakery toward the east corner. By the time people gathered, lanterns swinging in jittery arcs that caught fractured shadows, the scene was clear as day. The baker's wife stood in the doorway, pointing toward the fields just past the town's limits, her face pale and her body shaking. When the others squinted their eyes and turned lamps to the direction of her hand, they saw it too, smoke rising faint in the moonlight. A farm burning slow under the stars, and the bandits hadn't stopped to watch. Their silhouettes, 4 or 5 of them horseback, were already galloping toward the faint horizon, the fire leaving their trail. Someone muttered something about the Jacksons' farm, but even before the words hit air, the more pressing realization landed. The stranger, the boy, they were on the same horizon line, and worse, headed straight for the fire. The fire licked the horizon with wild, greedy fingers, turning the black of night into a sickly orange haze. Smoke rode the wind like a bandit itself, curling into the sky and carrying with it the smell of ruin. By the time the townsfolk made their way closer to the edge of the fields, cautious and clutching their hunting rifles like shields, the Jacksons' farm was nothing but charred timbers and embers glowing faintly in the darkness, and no sign of the Jacksons themselves. "What kind of man burns a family's home out on a night like this?" muttered a ranch hand, a young one by the look of him, still clutching at his nerves as tightly as his rifle. "Not men," came an older reply, from someone in the group I didn't recognize. "Wolves wearing human skin, same as always." I kept to myself, watching carefully from farther back in the jittery crowd. Words had a way of hiding truths on nights like these, and while the others murmured their judgments and prayers for the Jacksons, I saw something they didn't. Tracks in the dirt, faint and scattered in the firelight, but tracks nonetheless. 2 riders, splitting east from the fire. The stranger and his boy. "Where's Mr. Jackson?" A voice finally broke the murmurs, loud enough to cut through the smoke, but soft enough to carry the weight of fear. It was Paxton, the preacher, holding an old hunting pistol and barely concealing the shake in his hand. "Someone's got to look for him. This place didn't burn itself." No one stepped forward. The mob shuffled awkwardly for a moment, the firelight stretching their faces into long shadows on the ruined earth. It's one thing to cry outrage into the wind. It's another to follow smoke and echoes into the dark where death might be waiting. Then a voice rose up, sharp, cutting. "Trails lead east." Heads turned. It was Barton, a half-drunk ex-rancher who'd only mounted his fear by tethering it to whiskey beforehand. I saw him head that way earlier. The stranger. "Yeah," someone added from the back. "He rode in here with his kid. Probably figured this hick town'd make for an easy mark." "That's so." Paxton hesitated, his eyes darting toward the smoldering farmhouse one last time. What did he want? Money? No, just... The words tangled up clumsily before being spat. "Just trouble, that's all." It didn't take long for rumors to do what fire does. Once it catches wind, it spreads. The few men brave enough or mad enough to suggest a posse were already shaping their hasty narrative of guilt. And just as the flames at the farm simmered to embers, a warlike energy sparked to replace it. "We go," Paxton said, his last shred of doubt buried beneath the weight of the crowd's need for blame. "If he's not guilty, he'll speak his case to the barrel of a rifle." By the faint light of their group's lanterns, boots thudding and horses bridled too hurriedly to stay calm, they rode out onto the tracks I'd suspected. Dust and smoke hung low to the ground now, like ghosts deciding whether to stay. As for me, I don't trust riders at night. Their mob rattled further into the dark, convinced they were God's messengers of justice, streaking out to deliver holy judgment. Only thing I knew from watching the good Lord deal with folks in this county, His judgment fell sharp, bloody cold, and rarely landed clean. When they found the stranger, the boy was crying. Not loud, mind you. Not the terrified screams or tantrum wails of someone who doesn't know what else to do. Just small, hiccuping sobs muffled into the stranger's coat sleeve, where the man crouched low behind a dying clump of bushes. The mob spotted their pale silhouettes easy enough in their lantern glow, the stranger making no motion to fight or flee. Just sat there on his knees with the boy bundled close, his hat tossed to the dirt beside him. "Get up!" Paxton barked first, pistol aimed like shaky punctuation to his fear. "You've some explaining to do." The stranger looked straight past him, maybe through him. He was bloodied, now that the light illuminated him better, shallow gash across his temple, and his right arm hung limp at an unnatural angle. A fight behind him, for certain. But it wasn't the fire-stricken farm or their fury in his eyes. It was the horizon, the dark creeping amber shadow to the south. "Put up your gun," the stranger said softly. Paxton's brow furrowed with embarrassed confusion at first, then tightened stern, like a man seeing his bluff called for the first true time. "Gun's here because it needs to be. Unlike you." Over the soft hiss of wind cutting against clustered silence, the boy coughed. And that cough, the pathetic scratch of a throat raw from ash and fear, was what made Paxton hesitate the most. "So," Barton grumbled from behind, cattle prods shaking his back up. "Finger why you burnt this farm, stranger?" Didn't roll through that smoke purse looking to donate. "They're coming," spoke the man, not acknowledging the group entirely, but keeping his burnt-out gaze still on the southward trail. To finish. "Who?" "Riders." That word hushed most folk right where they stood. Riders, not a group, not vaguely bandits. The kind of men farming mothers warned their kin not to believe exist. Men who had no law guiding their quick bullets into poorer homes like Jackson's. Wind swirled air close, droplets flickering red animously at some soon bloodshed's make. The silence that followed the stranger's words wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. It pressed down on the posse like a lead weight on their lungs, stealing the breath right out of their bravado. I wasn't surprised. When man says riders in these parts, it doesn't mean rowdy travelers passing through. It means wolves on horseback, men who live for fire and blood, men who take without asking and kill without thinking. "They're coming," the stranger said again, voice as ragged as his torn coat. "They'll be here before long, and they won't care who stands in their way." Someone in the group scoffed nervously. "Barton, I think. How do you know they're coming, huh? Maybe it's you bringing them here." The stranger didn't flinch, didn't even glance at the man. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, dark, endless, and humming like a taut string about to snap. He shifted, wincing as he adjusted the boy at his side. The kid looked barely awake now, his small fist clutching at the stranger's sleeve like it was the only thing tethering him to this world. "I was with the Jacksons," the stranger said finally, his words slow and deliberate. "When they came." The murmurs began, a ripple of unease spreading through the posse, like cold fingers dragging down their spines. Paxton stepped forward, lantern trembling in his hand. "You were with them," he repeated, each syllable laced with suspicion. "And yet here you are, alive." The stranger's jaw tightened. The Jacksons didn't stand a chance. The confession hung in the air like the smoke drifting from the ruins behind them. One by one, the men began to shrink back, moving just a step or two, but enough to reveal the fear gnawing at their resolve. "You ran," someone muttered bitterly from the back, though no one dared make it louder. "I fought," the stranger snapped, his voice a low growl that cut through the tension like the crack of a whip. His face, now visible in the flickering light, was hardened like stone, etched with lines of exhaustion, pain, and anger. "I did what I could to get the boy out, but no one else," he trailed off, his gaze dropping briefly to the child, who stirred restlessly in his arms. "No one else made it." The posse exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked at the boy, pity flickering behind their suspicion. Others stared at the stranger like he was a coyote caught in a trap, dangerous, cornered, unpredictable. But Paxton frowned, his grip tightening on the pistol at his side. "So you fought," he said skeptically. "And you reckon these riders are coming back? How can we even trust you're not one of them?" The stranger's eyes flicked to him then, blazing with something fierce and unrelenting. "You think I'd drag a child into that?" His voice rose, sharp with indignation. "You think I'd risk his life for their dirty work?" Paxton faltered under the intensity of the man's gaze, but his pride held firm. "Might be you're just leading. I'm here for an easy shot." He shot back, though the crack in his tone betrayed his own doubts. "For all we know, you're using the boy as cover." The stranger stood slowly, wincing as he braced himself against the pain in his wounded arm. He towered over Paxton now, despite the slump in his shoulders. "If you think I'm lying," he said coldly, "then point that pistol and pull the trigger. But don't waste my time while we've got precious little of it." No one moved. Even Paxton found himself rooted to the spot, unable or unwilling to meet the stranger's challenge. For the first time, the lanterns casting their light on the ragged man revealed something the others hadn't seen before: the truth. Whatever storm the stranger had ridden through wasn't of his making, but it had left its mark, and now it was heading straight for them. "I've seen him," the stranger continued, quieter now but no less intense. "Watch them tear through the Jackson's place like it was kindling. They're not just looking for loot. They're looking for something, someone, and they don't leave witnesses." "What do they want?" Barton's voice cut through the thick air, jittery and uncertain. The stranger glanced down at the boy, then back at the horizon. "Does it matter?" he said grimly. "The only thing you should care about is keeping your town off their map." The wind picked up then, sweeping across the plains like the breath of some ancient beast waking from its slumber. In the distance, faint and rhythmic, came the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats. At first, it was just a whisper against the earth, a thrum more felt than heard, but it grew steadily, each beat louder, closer, and more insistent. "They're coming," the stranger murmured again, as if speaking a prayer or a curse. The mob froze, their tense faces illuminated by the shifting lantern light. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over, threatening to consume them entirely. Without a word, one of the younger men turned and bolted back toward town, his rifle swinging uselessly at his side. He wasn't the last. One by one, the posse began to unravel, their flimsy courage giving way to survival instinct. Paxton remained rooted, though his pistol trembled in his grip. What do we do?" he stammered, the preacher in him grasping for some higher wisdom that refused to come. The stranger turned toward the gathering shadows on the horizon. His answer was as calm as it was damning. "You get ready." By the time the riders appeared on the horizon, most of the posse had fled back toward town, the sound of their boots fading into the night. All that remained behind were the preacher, Barton, and two others whose names I didn't know, men too stubborn or too frightened to leave outright. But fear never stayed quiet for long. I saw it in their eyes, how it hollowed them out like worms tunneling through wood. They clutched their rifles tightly, the weight of iron doing little to steady the tremors in their hands. The stranger barely spared them a glance. He stood a dozen paces away, squinting at the oncoming riders, his wounded arm cradled against his chest. His boy sat slumped at his feet, curled into a bundle beside a rock like he'd already learned how to make himself invisible. "They're close," the stranger muttered, his voice low and even. 10, maybe 15 minutes. No more." The preacher stiffened. "How many?" 6, maybe 7. The count hit Barton like a slap across the face, though he tried to hide it. "We outnumber 'em," he spat, his words ringing hollow in the still, smoky air. "We got guns, too. They ain't invincible." The stranger turned then, slowly, fixing Barton with a look that could have splintered bone. "They've been riding this land longer than you've been drawing breath," he said evenly. "You think they fear guns? They use fear like a blade, and you're already bleeding." Barton stammered, his grip tightening on his rifle. He opened his mouth to counter the stranger's words, but nothing came out. A quick glance at the preacher showed no help. Paxton looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. "Do you have a plan?" Paxton finally asked, his shaky voice doing little to hide his desperation. The stranger knelt beside the boy, brushing ash and dust off his face with a gentleness that seemed wholly out of place against the violence looming ahead. "I've got one," he said, his tone almost too soft for the words to carry. "But it won't save everyone." The boy reached up, clutching at the stranger's sleeve. "Are they?" His voice cracked, tiny and broken. "They won't touch you," the stranger said firmly, squeezing the boy's hand before standing and turning back to the others. "First things first, don't fight stupid." Barton bristled. "Stupid? I'm no coward, and I'm not letting him cut me down like cattle." "No," the stranger replied coolly. "You're letting fear cut you down. Keep fighting loud, and there's a chance you'll give yourself a way out." He gestured toward the scattering of ruins ahead. The broken remnants of the Jacksons' homestead lie splintered across the dirt. A toppled wooden fence marked the outer boundary, while thick piles of ash and partially gutted timbers formed a crooked shape, no longer a house, but simply wreckage. Beyond that, flat, open earth stretching toward the shadows of trees. "We make our stand there," he said, pointing toward the edge of the wreckage. "Even riders need cover to dismount. If they think we're bunched inside the ruins, they won't waste time circling wide." "And what if they do circle?" Paxton asked nervously. "That's your job," the stranger replied, tossing a lantern toward the preacher's hands. "Use that light of yours to fake a backdraw. Make shadows by east timber. Western flank open entry stays obvious. It'll split their approach far enough for 2 rifle posts. Front stays fluid, but make range options capable through grid break spots." Both Paxton, Barton hesitated, understanding chill linger. The riders came like wolves at midnight, their silhouettes cutting black against the dim moonlight. The sound of their hooves thundered across the open prairie, growing louder with each passing second. Dust trailed them, an exhalation of chaos that hinted at their arrival before the men themselves appeared, a storm bearing teeth. From the cover of the scorched Jackson homestead, the stranger stood tall, rifle held steady in his good hand. Beside him, Barton crouched low, muttering curses under his breath as he shifted nervously behind a splintering pile of timbers. The 2 unnamed men flanked them, faces pale, eyes wide. Paxton stood farther back, near the crumbled remains of the barn, gripping the lantern tightly. He was supposed to signal, but anyone could see the man's conviction was unraveling by the second. The boy, the stranger, had hidden him well, beneath a charred trough, tucked quiet and still like a wild rabbit in its burrow. I'd seen kids survive terror before. Survival, after all, was rarely taught. It was lived. "They're splitting," the stranger said grimly, his gaze fixed on the riders' formation, now clearer as they drew closer. He was right. The pack had fanned out, some veering east toward the preacher's flickering lantern, others angling wide around the main debris. To test the perimeter, perhaps, or to cut off escape routes. These were men who'd done this before, men with instincts sharp as blades. "You lied," Barton hissed at the stranger, his grip tight on the rifle. "You said they'd come full on. You set us up." "No one's stopping you from running," the stranger replied without looking at him. His voice was calm, steady, a dangerous thing to be in the face of death. "But if you aim for the flank rider," he continued, scanning the group, "third from the left, he's leading. You can cut their head off before they tighten the noose." Barton hesitated, his breathing labored now. His knuckles whitened against the rifle stock, but he forced himself to take aim. The first shot cracked through the night like a whip, sending a shiver that rippled across the ground. The lead rider's horse reared, startled and jerking wildly. Barton hadn't hit his mark, but he'd done enough to halt the forward momentum. The stranger didn't waste a second. He raised his rifle, firing off a clean shot. This one didn't miss. A rider slumped sideways in his saddle and tumbled to the dirt. The chaos that followed was the brutal kind, raw, unrelenting. Within seconds, the riders adjusted, spurring their horses faster as they charged forward. Gunfire rang out from the shadows, flashes of light illuminating flashes of death. Barton and the 2 men returned fire almost desperately, the shots wild but constant, their resolve hanging on not by bravery but sheer, frantic instinct. Then came the knives, gleaming streaks hurtling through the air. One found its mark in the leg of the nearest unnamed man, the howl of pain cutting through the gunshots. He went down fast, clutching his thigh as blood seeped into the dust around him. The second man lost his rifle in the confusion, scrambling clumsily for a sidearm he never got a chance to use. A knife caught his throat clean, and he crumpled, gurgling. Barton fired again, his face now pale as death. "There's too many," he bellowed, retreating further into the ruins as two riders vaulted from their horses, sprinting toward him with pistols drawn. The stranger, meanwhile, never moved from his position. His shots were methodical, precise, a stark contrast to the chaos consuming the others. Another rider fell, then another, but even he couldn't keep them all at bay. A bullet grazed his cheek, tearing it open, the blood stark and black against his dirt-covered skin. "Paxton!" the stranger shouted, his voice cutting above the cacophony. The signal. But the preacher didn't move. His lantern wavered in trembling hands, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him, a hell he clearly hadn't expected to face. The stranger growled in frustration, snapping the lever of his rifle into place as another rider closed in. This one came fast and hard, dismounting before he reached the stranger and charging with a blade. There was no hesitation in his movements, no fear, just a predator honing in on its prey. The stranger blocked the first strike with his rifle, the force of the blow knocking him backward into the ash and dust. The rider followed up with a brutal kick to the stomach, sending the stranger sprawling. For a moment, it seemed over. The stranger lay flat on his back, his injured arm useless, the blade gleaming in the firelight as it came down toward his throat. But sheer instinct kicked in, and the stranger rolled to the side at the last second, grabbing at a piece of broken wood with his good hand and plunging it upward. The rider's eyes widened in shock before he collapsed lifeless on top of his would-be victim. The stranger shoved the body aside, panting heavily as he staggered to his feet. "Paxton!" he roared again. Now, this time, the preacher snapped out of his paralysis, stumbling forward with the lantern. He swung it wildly through the air before hurling it toward the eastern flank. The glass shattered on impact, igniting the small patch of dry brush beneath the riders. The flames hissed and spread fast, creating a wall of fire that sent the remaining attackers scattering. For the first time that night, the tide seemed to turn. The fire burned bright against the darkness, a wall of angry flames splitting the battlefield into chaos. The riders scattered first, their mounts rearing and circling at the sudden blaze. The sharp crack of breaking glass and the hiss of the inferno had startled even the most seasoned of the attackers, forcing them to reconsider their approach. But it didn't take long for their leader, a tall, lean figure with a face painted white and red like a skull, to bark orders. His voice carried over the roar of the fire, sharp and commanding. He wasn't the kind to run. He was the kind who chose fight over flight every time, and his men followed that instinct without hesitation. The stranger wiped blood from his cheek, his chest rising and falling heavily as he readied the rifle in his one working hand. His movements were slower now, the fight having taken its toll, but his grip remained steady, his gaze sharp. He stood in the center of the ruined homestead, framed in the flickering light of the flames, like some lone sentinel against the storm. Behind him, Barton huddled near the remains of the house, firing off shots with what ammunition he had left. The preacher, shaken but still clinging to survival, scurried back toward the barn, his face pale and his lantern cast aside. Of the two unnamed men, one still clutched his bleeding leg, crying out in agony with every move. The other lay crumpled in the dirt, lifeless. The boy remained hidden near the trough, his small frame pressed tightly into the shadows. His face wasn't visible, but one could imagine his wide, frightened eyes, the weight of violence thrust upon him before he'd ever had a chance to grow up. "They'll push through the fire," the stranger muttered, his voice carrying to those who were left. "They've got numbers, and they've got nothing to lose." "What then?" Barton snapped. His hands shook as he tried to reload, panicked and clumsy. "What the hell do we do now?" The stranger didn't answer right away. He glanced at the flames, at the riders regrouping just beyond them, and then at the boy. His jaw tightened, lips pressed into a firm line. He knew full well the odds were against them. "We hold," he said finally. "We hold until it's over." The riders came fast, charging through the fire with reckless abandon. Their leader led the way, his skeletal face illuminated by the blaze, a pistol raised high as he fired into the ruins. His men followed, wild calls echoing into the night, the flashing gleam of blades slicing through smoke and shadows. The stranger fired first, the crack of his rifle breaking through the chaos. He hit his mark, a rider on the left flank, sending the man spiraling off his horse into the dirt. Barton followed suit, though his aim was less precise. His shot nicked a horse's flank, causing it to stumble, but the rider atop it launched forward, slashing downward with a knife as he landed. The stranger spun to meet him, blocking the swipe with the butt of his rifle before delivering a sharp kick to the man's knee. The rider groaned but didn't go down immediately. Swinging again with stubborn ferocity, the stranger sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it sharply. There was a sickening crack as the bone gave way, and the rider collapsed onto the ground, writhing in pain. But there were more. Too many. Barton screamed as another rider closed in, the man tackling him into the ashes and knocking his rifle free. They wrestled furiously, fists and blades clashing in a desperate, bloody struggle. Barton wasn't a fighter. He lacked a raw instinct for close combat, but his desperation gave him one last burst of strength. He grabbed a shard of timber and drove it upward. The rider above him froze, eyes wide, before slumping forward lifeless. "Barton!" the stranger called, but there was no response. The man lay still, his body limp beneath the weight of the attacker he'd killed. The preacher fired wildly from his position near the barn, his hand shaking so badly that none of his shots landed. He muttered frantic prayers between each pull of the trigger, sweat streaming down his face as the riders drew closer. He wasn't built for this. He was a man who dealt in hope and words, not bullets and death. The fire roared higher now, creating a wall of flickering orange that separated the last remnants of the defenders from the riders' main group. But it wouldn't last. The flames were a temporary shield, and the attackers would find a way through. The stranger took action, springing into motion despite the pain in his arm and the exhaustion weighing him down. He scanned the field, counting the riders who still stood upright. 3, maybe 4. He'd taken out several, but the leader remained, his skeletal face still visible through the haze as he barked orders to his men. "You want me?" the stranger shouted across the field. His voice carried, bold and unyielding. "Come and take me." The leader turned, his painted eyes narrowing as he spotted the man standing in the center of the chaos. With a sharp motion, he spurred his horse forward, charging straight for him. The stranger raised his rifle, but froze. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Small, quick movement. The boy had emerged from his hiding spot, darting toward the stranger like a frightened animal seeking its protector. "Stay back!" the stranger shouted, his voice breaking. But it was too late. The skeletal rider had seen him. The boy was exposed, vulnerable, and the leader angled his horse to intercept. The stranger moved without thinking, abandoning his position and sprinting toward the boy. He reached him just as the rider swung his blade downward. The stranger blocked the strike with his rifle, the impact jarring his injured arm, but giving him just enough leverage to shove the boy aside. In one fluid motion, the stranger grabbed the knife from the rider's hand, twisting upward as the blade turned. It sank deep into the leader's chest, piercing through painted flesh. The rider gasped, his skeletal face contorting in shock before collapsing. His horse reared and galloped off into the smoke. The remaining riders hesitated, their leader's death breaking their momentum. In the distance, the preacher's shots rang out again, wild but loud enough to serve as a warning. For the first time, the attackers faltered. Slowly, one by one, the surviving riders retreated. They backed away, disappearing into the haze and shadow, their calls fading into the night as they vanished into the wilderness from which they came. The stranger slumped to the ground, panting heavily, his rifle discarded beside him. Ash and blood painted his skin, his torn coat hanging loose from his battered frame. The boy crawled toward him, clutching at his sleeve as silent tears streamed down his face. "It's over," the preacher muttered, his voice shaky. The boy didn't reply, didn't say anything at all. He simply buried his face in the stranger's chest, trembling softly. The stranger placed his good hand on the boy's back, holding him close. He didn't say a word either. He didn't need to. "See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you."